Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika prana natapada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattatam Shri Gurum bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Madhupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudake Datu Bande Bhagavata Nimananudhavam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namni Gaura Tishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Bandhan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Murachita Jeba Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna Upajive Priti Janivera Serariti Shunile Borohohit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhaktas Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, a royal swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Chaitanya Lila, wherefrom the very essence of Krishna Lila stream in the 10 directions, Sri Krishnadas Kaviraja Goswami Pad. Again today we'll absorb ourselves in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. And we resume in the Sanatana Shiksha, chapter 22, discussing the Abhideya Tattva, and specifically we're discussing Shraddha, the eligibility or the primary feature of eligibility or adhikar for the path of bhakti, and specifically the path of Ananya Bhakti, Uttama Bhakti, Shuddha Bhakti, as taught by Sriman Mahaprabhu here to the Goswamis, and as is recorded in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and their other works. So in our last class, we discussed a manner in which Shraddha, the term Shraddha, is defined as very firm conviction that by performing Krishna Bhakti, everything is performed. In other words, one doesn't need to do anything other than Krishna Bhakti. And by performing Krishna Bhakti, whatever responsibilities that one has otherwise, as per the path of karma, are automatically fulfilled. So today we'll look at a verse of the Bhagavatam, which Sriman Mahaprabhu is said to cite here to illustrate the way that he defined the term Shraddha in our last class. And we also looked at extended discussion of how the term Shraddha is explained by Jiva Gosvami in his Sandarbhas, in his commentaries on the Bhagavatam, as well as some supporting points from Sri Chakravarti Pad and other writers. And in particular, the point was made that Shraddha is said by Jiva Gosvami to mean Shraddha in the meaning of Shastra, or the object of Shastra, the Shastra-arta Vishwas, which is acquired by hearing Shastra from the sadhus. So, if we were to characterize that arta, or that meaning or object being described in the Shastra, then principally that object is the Shastra's abhideya, or that which is to be stated in the Shastra, since the purpose of the Shastra is to enjoin action, since Shastra itself is defined as a means of governance, or a means of guiding and educating others. So the principal aspect of the arta of the Shastra is that Krishna Bhakti is the abhideya, which is the topic that this whole chapter is about, and which was discussed at length in the early portion of the chapter. So as per the conclusions, etc., that were heard in the early part of the chapter, the conclusion is put forth that Krishna Bhakti is the principal abhideya. And now, when eligibility for the path of following that is being discussed, and Shraddha is being given as the criterion for that, then that Shraddha is, guess what? Shraddha in that conclusion. What else would it be? So Shraddha that by performing Krishna Bhakti, no other path needs to be adhered to, no shortcoming will befall one as a result of engaging fully in the path of Bhakti. This conviction is necessary to be eligible for the path of Bhakti. Without that conviction, one remains duty-bound to one's responsibilities as dictated by the karma marg, as per the social worldview in which these shastras are written. And by acquiring that eligibility for the path of bhakti, by having shraddha in the meaning of shastra, in other words, in the idea that Krishna bhakti is the principal abhideya of the shastra, then one loses one's eligibility for the path of karma. It becomes, at that point, a fault to retain observances of the path of karma that are unfavorable to to and rather it becomes one's responsibility to engage wholly in the path of bhakti. So, to illustrate these points, we have a verse from the 4th canto of the Bhagavad. So today we'll look at the acaryas' commentaries on this verse and why it's being cited by Mahaprabhu to illustrate the point that he's making. And then we'll go further into the discussion of Shraddha and look at how Shraddha exists in a gradation. So, with that, I will begin. Yatha taror mula nishechanena tripyanti tat skanda bujo pashaka pranopaharat.
You haven't shared the file yet.
I must have shared it before you logged in.
Oh.
In the future, if that's happening, please write it in the text so that it's Yatha taror mula nishechanena tripyanti tat skanda bujo pashaka pranopaharat chayatendriyanam tatayvasar varhanamachuteja. As the trunks, branches, and sub-branches of a tree are all satiated by watering the root thereof, and as satiation of the sense organs comes about as a result of an offering of food to the vital air, so exactly honoring of all beings comes about by worship of Achyuta. I'll read it one more time. As the trunks, branches, and sub-branches of a tree are all satiated by watering the root thereof, and as satiation of the sense organs comes about as a result of an offering of food to the vital air, so exactly honoring of all beings comes about by worship of Achyuta. So we'll look at the Bhavartha-dipika on this verse, which was cited almost entirely by Jiva Gosvami in the Bhakti Sandarbha. Quote, moreover, even the results of various karmas, the cause of which is the satisfaction of various devatas, occur as a result of the satisfaction of Hari, and nothing rather occurs as a result of worship of the various devatas alone, without the satisfaction of Hari. He explains this with an illustration. He speaks this verse. So worship, be it aradhana or yajna or archana or puja or what have you, the purpose of this is to satisfy whom it is offered to. So sometimes it can be conceived as per the English word propitiation. That, it's not that literally simply placing a substance in front of someone else is worship, but rather that one performs an act which results in the satisfaction of the other, and that the usage of the offering of a substance is somehow a media or a means by which pleasure is arrived at by the recipient. This is, in essence, worship. So, he's saying here that when Hari is satisfied, the devatas are satisfied. By performing various types of karma, the devas can be satisfied. The end result is the same. The devas are satisfied. So if the end result is achieved by a means other than simply worshipping the devatas with some acts of karma, there's no loss, or there's nothing, there's no fault in that. The same result is achieved. Whereas, if one satisfies the devatas but not Hari, then there is a loss, or there is a fault, there's a lack of satisfaction of he who's meant to be shown this, brought the supreme satisfaction. So if Hari is satisfied, and thereby the devatas are satisfied, then all are satisfied. So this is holistic, or this is free from any shortcoming. So this is the point being illustrated. So, trunks, that is, the first divisions of a tree from the roots, branches, that is, divisions of those trunks, and sub-branches of these as well, the description being an indicator of leaves, flowers, and so on as well, are satiated by watering the tree's root, and not rather by watering of themselves without watering the roots. So if you just pour water on the flowers and the leaves of a tree, it's not nourished in the same way as it is by watering its root. But by watering its root, automatically its internal mechanism distributes that water wherever it's required among its flowers, its leaves, its bark, etc. Similarly, by worshipping Achyuta, then the satisfaction Achyuta feels is passed on to the devatas or wherever it needs to be sent, so to speak, and therefore there's the whole is satisfied by satisfying Achyuta, who's compared to the root. Then he gives a second illustration. An offering to the vital air refers to food. For from that alone satiation of the sense organs occurs, and not rather from smearing food separately upon each of these sense organs. In other words, when you eat, then the body automatically distributes whatever, vitamins, nutrients, what have you, are required for the various organs within the body to function in an optimal manner. But if you were to just apply food to those parts of the body directly, the same effect won't be had. There's the story of Siddha Krishnadas Babaji after he returns from Jaipur, after he's consulted with Jai Krishnadas Baba of Kamyavan. He's now engaged in his bhajan near Nandagram, but he eats only flower and neem leaves for a prolonged period of time, such that he began to go blind. And in this state, he became quite uneasy, if you will, and this led to a fervency of prayer, whereby he ultimately had a vision of Lalita Devi and Radharani. So, he, I mean, for the sake of our purpose, we're saying, why did he start to go blind? Because he was malnourished. Because he didn't eat sufficiently such that his eyes received the nutrients that they would need to see properly. But after Lalita Devi gave him some nourishing food, and he ate that, then again his sight was restored, and he went on to write the works that he did, and so on and so forth. So it's only by, an offering of food that all of the organs within the body are nourished such that they function properly. These are well-known points. Similarly, furthermore, worship of Achyuta is itself worship of all the devatas, and not separate from that. Meaning, by worshipping Achyuta, all the devatas are worshipped, such that there is no need to worship the devatas separately. This is the meaning. Sri Sanatana Pad restates Sri Samipad's commentary in full, in his commentary on this verse in his Digdarshani Tika on Hari Bhakti Vilas, with the lone exception that he introduces the verse as follows. Quote, satisfaction of the world occurs only by means of worship of Sri Bhagavan. He explains this with an illustration. So, all the devatas are satisfied. More broadly, that implies that the whole world is satisfied, since the devatas are understood to be the providers of the resources that lead to peace, prosperity, flourishing, so forth in the world. So when Hari is satisfied, the devatas are satisfied. When the devatas are satisfied, there shall be prosperity. And when prosperity is present, then all shall be satisfied. There may be a conventional notion like this applied, as per, statements in the 4th chapter of the Gita and so on. Alternately, Jiva Gosvami introduces the verse as follows. Having thus described the culmination in Sri Hari alone of the karma and jnana sections of the Vedas, he describes the culmination in Sri Hari of the upasana section of the Vedas as well. So, here another perspective. The Veda is sometimes said to have 3 principal sections, the karma, jnana, and upasana sections. So there is, profuse detail and discussion throughout this upasana kanda of elaborate forms of yajna and other types of worship to satisfy various devatas. The, huge volume of discussion on this type of stuff in the Vedas. So here in the Bhagavatam, the teaching is given that of all of these yajnas taught throughout all these Vedas, the ultimate purpose of them, or the purpose that can be partially achieved by them, can be achieved in full by performing worship of Hari, rather than all these various, elaborate, complicated, difficult to perform yajnas described elsewhere throughout the Upasana Kanda. So to convey that idea, this verse is spoken. That is also its import as per Jiva Goswami's view. And Jiva Goswami cites this verse many times in his Bhakti Sandarbha to draw out further important implications of the significance of the path of bhakti. So we'll look at a few of these. Quote, worship of Sri Bhagavan is a cause of the accomplishment of all dharmas, as per this verse. So you can satisfy all devatas by worshipping the supreme devata, Hari. Similarly, you can perform all dharmas by performing the paramadharma of worship of Hari. Also, as per this verse, when attendant service of Hari is performed, worship even of all other devatas and so forth is accomplished of its own accord. Because of this as well, there is universality of Bhagavad Bhakti. So, many procedures are not universal. They're applicable to a particular group, and they have a particular benefit, which is of a limited scope. However, to establish bhakti as the principal abhideya of the Shastra, it has to be shown that this is of universal application. It's something that is applicable and beneficial to all in all cases. So, he takes this verse as illustrative of that, meaning that when you worship Hari, then automatically whatever worship you would have offered to others is accomplished thereby. So you achieve a universality of benefit or of worshipping all by worshipping one. Bhakti's being a cause of satisfaction of all beings is stated also by this verse. So, although, if someone performs Hari, it might not literally even, people down the street or, across the village may or may not even be aware whether the person performed Bhakti or not in a literal or practical sense. But nevertheless, the idea is that all beings are satisfied by worshipping Bhagavan, meaning they may not be directly conscious of your act of worship being a cause of their satisfaction, but the idea is that all satisfaction felt by all people is ultimately granted by Bhagavan himself. This is stated by Mahaprabhu in one case in the Caitanya-caritamrta, where he says, all sukh, the ultimate cause of all happiness, is Krishna Kripa. And that Kripa is given, or prasad, right, is an outcome of prasannata. One, expresses or gives prasad when they feel prasanna, which means satisfied. So Hari is satisfied by worship such that he's gracious, such that all are favored, such that they become happy. In this way, the link of causation can be conceived. And one more point. And it is not that separate individual worship of the devatas and so forth is to be done even with the intent only of satisfaction of them. So this is a fine point that Jiva Gosvami gets into, specifically when he's talking about Shraddha in the Bhakti Sandarbha. So the idea is that someone may say, okay, we accept that by worshipping Hari, all the other devatas are satisfied, and that there's no duty to worship them. But what if we just want to worship them? What if we just want to make them happy? What if we don't want to get anything out of it, and we're not thinking that we have to do it, but nevertheless we just want to please these devatas? In that case, can't we do it anyway? This, is an objection, so to speak, or a query that he's addressing. So to that he says, and it is not that separate individual worship of the devas and so forth is to be done, even with the intent only of satisfaction of them. That is, even without the intent of receiving some reward from them for worshipping them, and simply worshipping them for their satisfaction, on account of the repetition thereof. In other words, why shouldn't you do it? Because it's redundant. That is, of redundantly performing an action meant to bring about their satisfaction, since simply worship of, Sri Bhagavan itself satisfies them, as per this verse. So it becomes redundant to worship the other devatas because they're pleased by worship of Hari. And we could add to that, you could say, well, okay, maybe they're pleased by worship of Hari, but can't they be extra pleased? Is there some limitation on how much satisfaction they can feel? Come on! Then to that we can say, actually these devatas are bhaktas, and the satisfaction they feel from seeing Bhagavan satisfied is greater than the satisfaction they feel from being worshipped directly. So not only is it redundant, but it causes a lesser degree of satisfaction anyway. That would be or we could, add that as a second layer of fortification to Jiva Goswami's point. And now let's look at one other point raised by Chakravarti Pad. He construes the purpose or the context of this verse as follows. An objection is raised. Well, as there is a necessity of karma, gyan, and so forth being mixed with bhakti, so there is certainly a necessity of bhaktis also being mixed with karma. Because of hearing in the Shastra of the occurrence of a transgression as a result of non-performance of compulsory karma, such as the compulsory karmas of worship of the devas, rishis, forefathers, and so on. So he's replying to this objection. This is, outside the context of those who would have the Shraddha that we're discussing thus far. And someone may say, okay, that if someone is following the path of bhakti, they should also follow the path of karma. They should also mix in some karma, since it's a neglect, it's a transgression to neglect that. In other words, I can accept that following the path of bhakti is good, or even more important than the path of karma, but shouldn't we just follow both? Can't we just retain the responsibilities and fulfill the responsibilities we have on the path of karma as a secondary aspect in our life that's, in suit with the primary purpose we have of bhakti to Bhagavan? Can't it be like that? So, to reply to that, this verse is spoken. The implication being that he speaks this verse to address this objection, and thereby clarifies that no transgression occurs on the part of a bearer of eligibility for bhakti as a result of not performing worship the devatas and so on, because the devas and so on are propitiated just by one's worship of Sri Bhagavan. So in other words, no, don't worry about it. It's not a transgression. You're not going to be at fault for neglecting that task. That task is automatically accomplished anyway. So another point that he raises, after explaining the analogy of watering the root of the tree, is then you might say, well, why does the verse give two analogies? Is there some shortcoming in the analogy of the tree root? Doesn't that convey the whole point? Why bother writing a whole other line with a whole other analogy? What does the second analogy convey that the first does not? So to address this potential objection, Chakravarti Pad further comments as follows. Well, this is the objection, well, let this be so only for one who is incapable of worshipping the devas, rishis, forefathers, and so on, in addition to worshipping Achyuta. Worship of Achyuta and of the devas and others, that is, the rishis, forefathers, and others who are considered necessary to worship on the path of karma, is to be performed by the capable, just as no fault occurs as a result of watering the trunk of a tree, and so also above the roots, and rather there is verily a virtue in doing so. So sometimes injunctions are given as per the relative capability of individuals rather than on the relative merits of activities. So if thus far it's been argued that one should perform the act of Bhagavad Bhakti and not bother to engage in the worship of various devatas, then one can say, okay, I agree, but you must be saying that I should only worship the devas, that I should only worship Hari and not the other devas, because you're assuming I'm incapable of doing both. But what if I am? What if I can do both? And wouldn't that be good? Wouldn't that also be virtuous to include both? Just as you water the root of the tree, agreed. But if you also, give the leaves a bit of a wash and give the tree a bit of a spray, isn't that also nice? This concern could arise, or this interpretation could be drawn from this analogy, which maybe is not so likely, but Chakravarti Pad is a very, very rich thinker, so in this way, he's drawing out some reason for the second analogy and saying, someone might think that it's also nice to spray the tree with water, so to preclude them from then taking from the analogy the idea that it would also be complementary and important and meritorious to also worship these devatas in addition to Hari, expecting this objection, he states another illustration. Quote, an offering to the vital air refers to food. From that alone, satiation of the sense organs occurs, and not rather from smearing food separately on each of the sense organs. Rather, a fault verily occurs if food is smeared upon the sense organs as a result of creating blindness, deafness, and so on in the eyes, ears, and so on. In other words, but you don't take food and stick it in your ear and rub it on your eye. That won't help you, that'll actually harm you. Like that, to think that we can also engage in these other activities and not only engage in the path of Bhagavan, that would be complementary, rather that will also be detrimental to you. In other words, the merit or the health, if you will, that can come about from aikantik or one-pointed Hari Bhakti, that will be hampered by the attitude that the objector is raising. So he gives this analogy to say that just as you don't put food anywhere else other than the one ideal place that it's meant, similarly, let us direct our worship to that ultimate primary recipient alone. So let's summarize what's given in this illustration or this evidential verse, as well as how it evidences the definition that we discussed in the previous class. So this is, you could say, the gist of all the previous discussion. In summary, Shraddha is defined in general as conviction in the meaning of Shastra that arises through hearing Shastra in the association of sadhus, and specifically as conviction that Krishna Bhakti is the supreme necessary practice. Let me put that just as kartabhya. Such that by performing it, all karmas are performed, meaning the whole of the world, including all living beings within it, led by the devas, rishis, forefathers, and human beings, are satisfied just by that bhakti to Sri Bhagavan, and thus there is no need for one to engage in worship of the devas or others directly, just as there is no need to water the branches, leaves, and other parts of a tree when one has already watered the tree's roots, or put food in other parts of the body when food is put in the stomach. Moreover, such Shraddha is not a part of bhakti itself, but rather is the primary requisite for eligibility for one-pointed or ananya bhakti, because bhakti is independently capable of producing its effects regardless of whether one who enacts it is possessed of Shraddha or not, and Shraddha is thus a requisite only because it acts as a cause of one making an endeavor to perform acts of bhakti one-pointedly, that is, to follow the path of one-pointed bhakti, or ananya bhakti, meaning uttama bhakti, shuddha bhakti, niskinchan bhakti, etc., as all the other adjectives for the path that are given in the Sandarbhas and elsewhere, since without Shraddha, one will have no impetus to engage in a sustained effort to perform bhakti. Without Shraddha, you won't have sustained effort to perform anything. In other words, if you don't have a minimal conviction in the value of performing an act, you won't perform the act. Or maybe on a whim you might perform it once, or as long as it seems fun, but you won't perform it in a sustained or one-pointed way unless you have conviction in its value. So therefore, having Shraddha in bhakti is essential and is a requisite to being eligible to follow the path of bhakti, because one won't have any sufficient motivation or impetus to engage in the path of bhakti otherwise. This is, common sense, so to speak. But that conviction in the path of bhakti should be based on the fact that that bhakti is the principal injunction of the Shastra, and should be based on adherence to that, as opposed to someone could acquire conviction in following the path of bhakti for other reasons. They could say, there's a local temple, they have nice music, they have nice food, they have nice people, I like it there, I'll go there regularly, I'll get married to someone in the community, it'll all be dandy. There can be, on a social level, other motivations that might also result in someone in a sustained or ongoing way carrying out a certain level of performance of activities of bhakti, motivated by motivations of belonging and pleasure and, social status and so on. But that is not the ideal motivation for which one should perform bhakti. So rather, the conviction should be based on the Shastra's import of why and how it is the principal injunction to be performed, why and how it is the supremely universal and pleasing act that one can do. It's only when one has conviction of that type that one will be sustained in one's endeavor to adhere to the path, regardless of what happens on the social level, regardless of what, society says, what's popular, what's unpopular, what's easy or what's hard, what's convenient or what's inconvenient, etc. So, as we heard about earlier in Chakravarti Pod's sharp commentaries saying, even if Brahma himself comes and tells me to follow something else, and even if I go to hell, I still won't leave the path of bhakti. One won't get that kind of conviction unless one hears Shastra from sadhus, and unless one has this understanding of why Krishna bhakti is the principal abhideya, or the quote, avashya parama kartabhya. So one needs the motivation, and one needs the motivation for the right reasons, or based on the right principles, in order to have a reliable, or you could say solid or firm motivation to adhere to the path. And as far as that is present, one will successfully follow the path, and to the extent one successfully follows the path, one will reach the goal. So, thus, such stress is placed on have understanding and acquiring the eligibility, or the adhikar. And thus, as it was defined above, as sudridha vishwas, or a very firm conviction. This is what is ideal, and this will be the strength, so to speak, or the power one has to progress along the path. Consequently, the conclusion is that it is Shraddha specifically that makes one eligible for the path of bhakti. That is, the path of pure bhakti, Uttama bhakti. And this is stated explicitly in the following payar. So now we'll come to the subject of gradation. Shraddhavan jan hoy bhakti adhikari, Uttama madhyama kanishta, Shraddha anusari. A person possessed of Shraddha is a bearer of eligibility, or adhikari, for bhakti. One is advanced, intermediate, or a neophyte, according to the relative firmness of one's Shraddha. So, the conclusion, the Shraddha that was afore defined as very firm conviction that by performing Krishna Bhakti, everything else is accomplished, that type of conviction, or one who has that type of Shraddha, they have eligibility for this path of Bhakti. But how much conviction do they have? How firm is that conviction? It might be advanced, it might be intermediate, it might be at a beginner level. So, according to the strength or the relative firmness of that Shraddha, one's level of adhikar is graded accordingly. The previous payar defined Shraddha as, quote, conviction, completely firm resolve, yet from the present payar it is understood that Shraddha is not always, quote, completely firm resolve. In other words, that's ideally what it is, but rather may exist in a graduation of relative firmness, the ideal form thereof being complete firmness. Eligibility for the path of bhakti thus exists in a gradation as per the relative degree of the firmness of one's Shraddha. This can be inferred from Sri Bhagavan's explanation to Mother Aditi in Srimad Bhagavatam, that the results produced by worship of himself come about in proportion to the degree of a worshipper's Shraddha. Quote, because of its being a cause of results in accord with one's Shraddha, worship of me should not go otherwise, that is, should never go in vain or lead to any unbefitting result. Sri Bhagavan also mentions this principle near the end of Brahma Samhita, with reference to instructions that are also given in or as the final advice in Srimad Bhagavad Gita. So, referring to the verse, Sarva Dharman Parityaja Mamekam Sharanam Braja, then this statement is made, completely relinquishing all other dharmas, worship me alone. Then he says, fostering conviction. In other words, apply that final instruction of the Gita on the basis of having conviction within it. And as we discussed earlier in the chapter, how is that conviction acquired? Arjuna was advised by Krishna, Vimishya, you do deliberation, you contemplate everything that I've told you, and yatechchasi tata kuru, and then, as you like, so you do. In other words, you can only acquire conviction if you've engaged in deliberation. You have to think about it. You have to get it, so to speak. And to get it in a meaningful way, you have to have, grasped the ideas. You have to have been taught it by someone who understands. You have to have heard the Shastra that describes it. So by, quote unquote, getting it and acquiring that conviction as a fruit of deliberation, then one can meaningfully engage in this act. So he says, completely relinquishing other dharmas, worship me, fostering conviction. Howsoever is the shraddha one fosters, so is the attainment or siddhi one achieves. So yadrishi shraddha, siddhi tadrishi. That the siddhi that you get, the accomplishment or the success, the result that comes, will be based on and be in accord with the shraddha that you have. So we'd all like to think that we want the goal of the path of bhakti, but whether we really do and what we even conceive that goal to be also are factors at play, and the depth of conviction that we have in that will be highly instrumental in the extent to which we ever achieve that goal. Bhagavan elsewhere promises, Yeyatamam prapadyante tangstataiva bhajamyaham, that I reciprocate with those in accord with how they approach me. So if we approach with little conviction, with lackluster shraddha, then Bhagavan is no doubt gracious and may favor us more than the level of shraddha that we have, but in comparison to the way that he'll feel inclined to reciprocate with someone who has extremely firm, apt conviction, then we also can understand there'll be a difference. So, on the basis of all of these points, we come to the conclusion that the better or the firmer the shraddha, the better. The more our conviction is sharp, the more our conviction is firm, the more we'll be able to follow the path, the greater our success would be. So in that way, this explanation is given about what is the eligibility for the path of bhakti, in the principal sense. So I'm going to pause here. From here, we go into more specific analysis of the adhikar and how or what makes these gradations between advanced, intermediate, and neophyte levels of shraddha, what distinguishes them. That's where the conversation goes next, but I'll just pause in case anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or otherwise at this stage. Yes.
Yes, Pranam Shri Krishna Dasa. So, in the spirit of deliberating on the content of the Shraddha that one should aspire for, I'm having trouble wrapping my head around part of the Shraddha. So the part where Krishna Bhakti is the kind of overriding injunction of the Shastra that overrides all other injunctions, that I can at least wrap my head around. But the part where Krishna Bhakti, I forget exactly how it's phrased, but the idea that by Krishna Bhakti, like the goals of all karmas are achieved, that part I'm having trouble, like, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just having trouble understanding how it could even be possible. So, like, to make sure I understand, is the idea that, like, any action whatsoever, whatever result could be acquired from that action, can be acquired in a better way through Krishna Bhakti? Is that the right track there, or?
You could say that. I mean, one way of looking at it would be, if you go to some government office seeking to get some particular government service, then the administrator there may allocate that service to you. But if the boss of that department or some head of state comes and gives the directive, then there's no doubt that it's coming to you.
Yeah.
Something like this.
Okay. I mean, that does make sense to me, and in the the previous pyar, the one just before the one we just started, there was the focus in the Caitanya-caritamrta text itself was on the devatas, and then in most of the commentary the focus was on the devatas too. So I guess my question is partly like, can we extend this to action that does not, like, I know all action involves the devatas in one way or another, whether you realize it or not. You know, every time you move your hand, you know, the devatas are involved and stuff. But what about, like, to give a more, like, I don't know, like, American example or something, like, say someone wants to become a really good violin player. You know, most people would say if you want to become a good violin player, you know, you got to practice every day, you need a violin teacher, and you need to, like, learn how to read music and all of that. But what if someone never touches a violin and just does Krishna bhakti? Can they become a good violin player that way? I don't, maybe this is a little bit of a contrived example, but
I mean, in one sense, you could say so. In other words, if
yeah.
if someone receives, you know, a boon, or someone has some desire, and then, you know, some higher arrangement is made for that in terms of how their karma is allocated, then
Yeah.
that will descend to them in the form of, you know, ultimately vrittis in the mind that enable them to perform some action. And whether it'll just happen by magic, that they'll just pick up a violin and suddenly play something. I did read a story once about some yogi who did do like that. So
Ah.
maybe, you know, but typically speaking, it means that you continue to try as per conventional standards, and by, you know, the favorable hand or the favorable support that comes from the fruition of one's worship, one will achieve success. Obviously, the purpose, not that we start worshiping devatas to get boons to become musicians. You know, this is not what we're
Yeah.
we're promoting. But no doubt, historically, there have been, you know, people throughout, you know, the centuries who very much have very worldly desires, very worldly objects that they seek to attain by the grace of, you know, various deities. I mean, you can go to, you know, if you go to Govardhan these days on some, you know, Ekadashi or Purnima, and you see all these thousands and thousands of people doing parikrama, go ask them why they do parikrama. You know, oh, we prayed for our third son to be born, and he was born to us. So, you know, Giriraj gave us our son, so we worship him. And we worshipped Giriraj to get, you know, a new house in such and such town for our new job, and Giriraj gave. You know, and you'll just hear like a million things of how people perform all different types of worship with the objective of achieving certain results. And then they also pursue those results according to their capacity, with the confidence they get from the idea that some favorable hand of Giriraj is going to work in their favor. And then when they get the fruit of that, they come back and, you know, worship Giriraj and rejoice at his mercy upon them. This is like, I mean, in just today's society, out not, you know, as like a principle of Gaudiya Vaishnava Siddhanta, but just as a reality of, you know, 2025 Hindu culture, this is extremely prevalent. And not just with Krishna or Giriraj. I mean, go to any Hindu temple anywhere practically, and this type of thinking is highly pervasive. So, in our case, you know, the idea of pursuing or seeking some specified worldly result from performing an act of bhakti, this was covered earlier when we discussed the topic of Dhruva. When he worshipped Bhagavan with the desire for a kingdom greater than his father's, and then ultimately when he got it, he just wept and realized that he prayed for, you know, shards of glass and neglected the jewel that was Bhagavan himself. So,
Yeah.
you know, there's all, when we talk about worship of devatas in contrast to worship of Bhagavan, there also is the specificity of the objective of the person we're talking about here. In other words, if their goal is simply to satisfy Bhagavan and achieve some higher spiritual result, or whether they're interested in material things, in that regard, there'll also be, you know, a spectrum of applications and attitudes.
would it be accurate to say that the question of whether a particular person is a bearer of eligibility for one-pointed bhakti is a different question than whether that person is engaging in unmotivated bhakti? Like, in principle, it would be possible for someone to have the shraddha that's described in the last couple payars, but to still be like Dhruva, right? Like, you could say maybe Dhruva had the shraddha at first when he had the shraddha, so he was a bearer of eligibility, but he wasn't pure in his motivations, and then later he became pure in his motivations, kind of. Or
Yes and no. As per only immediately the last few verses, if you decontextualize that, you could arrive at that distinction from that isolated set of phrases. However, read in the context of the whole chapter and read in the context of the rest of the Siddhanta, then no. Insofar as the path that Mahaprabhu is teaching here is only the path of Uttam Bhakti or Ananya Bhakti or what have you, this is what is being taught. So even if in these specific statements that element is not also literally said, because it's said earlier, because it's said later, we also understand that it's applicable in this context.
Okay. Thank you. I think I'll have to think about it more and read some of the other literature too. So, and then I think I'll understand better. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if you look earlier in the Rupa Shiksha, then points were made regarding Shuddha Bhakti, where we discussed the definition of Uttama Bhakti. And a little later in this chapter, the point also comes. All right, well, I think I'll leave it at that for today if there's no other comments. And we can just start fresh. Oh, excuse me?
I have a question.
Okay.
I would like to give more clarity on Shraddha. We have 3 levels of bhaktas roughly, right? Kanishta, Madhyam, Uttam, by which Shraddha is displayed and defined and observed, analyzed, but how is it really manifested in those particular cases? How, let's say, how one will identify depth of Shraddha? For example,
can I pause you for 1 sec?
Yes.
That's exactly what the next verses in the text discuss.
Okay.
So we'll definitely get into how that's discussed here in the Caritamrta, and in the coming commentary there's also a number of other criterions that Jiva Gosvami mentions in the Bhakti Sandarbha. So we will definitely dive into that topic.
Fine. Thank you.
So I think that can also function as the closer for the class. In the coming discussion, we'll look at how Rupa Gosvami, and in Jiva Goswami's commentaries, how he lays out the distinction in the relative firmness of Shraddha, and what makes Shraddha less or more firm, what are the characteristics of having a greater or lesser degree of firmness in one's Shraddha, and also a number of other aspects of gradation in Shraddha that are discussed by Jiva Gosvami elsewhere. So these are valuable tools for introspection, as well as valuable points of orientation about what is important to study, what is important to understand and contemplate, such that one can apply this principle we mentioned in the Gita of, reflecting on what one has been taught by Krishna himself, by Mahaprabhu himself here in the Shastra, and then, as one so wishes, fostering conviction and acting accordingly. And as per the depth of that, so too shall come the result. So, I conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Guru, Jai Gaur, Jai Jai, Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.